Rolla Country, North Dakota, August 1887. The sun hammered the prairie into a brass plate, the heat so intense it seemed to have weight. In this shimmering expanse of grass and sky, Mawgan Bolitho was digging a hole. Not a well, not a root cellar, but a vast rectangular pit, 9 feet deep and 40 feet long. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small hill beside the excavation, a raw brown wound on the green plains. From his buggy, Donovan Pridemore, the county land agent, watched the solitary figure swinging a pickaxe. Pridemore was a man who understood the prairie in terms of right angles and legal descriptions. He saw land as a commodity, improvement as a mandate. What he was seeing now fit no category he recognized. He climbed down, his polished boots sinking into the dry soil, followed by Caleb Finch, the region's most respected carpenter. "Bolitho," Pridemore called out, his voice sharp with authority. "A word." Mawgan Bolitho straightened up slowly. He was not a large man, but his shoulders and arms were thick with the dense muscle of a man who worked against geology for a living. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand and nodded, his pale Cornish eyes squinting in the glare. "That's a hell of a hole," Caleb Finch observed, peering over the edge. "Planning on burying a giant?" Silas Meade, a neighboring farmer who had ridden over, chuckled nervously. "Looks more like a grave for his own hopes, Caleb. No man builds a house by digging down." Pridemore ignored the banter. His concern was official. "Mawgan, the Homestead Act is specific. To patent this claim, you must erect an improved dwelling of no less than 12 by 14 feet. That means a house, with walls that go up, not down. A structure on the land, not under it." He gestured at the pit with a sweep of his hand. "This is a cellar. The government doesn't grant a man 160 acres for digging a cellar. This is foolishness." Mawgan looked from the land agent's stern face to the hole, then back again. His gaze was calm, unbothered. He picked up a jug of water, took a long swallow, and spoke in an accent thick with the granite of his homeland. "It will be a house," he said. "A house for moles," Finch muttered. Pridemore pressed on, his voice taking on the patient tone of a man explaining the obvious to a child. "A house has windows to let in light. It has a foundation to stand on. It has a roof to shed the snow. This is a trap. The first heavy snow will bury you alive. The spring thaw will flood you out. The government inspector will take one look, declare it unfit for human habitation, and your claim will be forfeit. You and your family will be out on your ear with nothing. Is that what you want?" Mawgan Bolitho looked at the sun, a merciless white disk in the vast blue. He seemed to be measuring something, the angle of the light, the length of the shadows. He looked at the hard-baked earth under his boots. Then he turned his quiet eyes back to the land agent. "It will be warm," he said, and with that he bent to his work, swinging the pickaxe into the unyielding Dakota clay. The men watched for another minute, shaking their heads at the mad Cornishman, digging his own family's grave. What did this Cornish tin mine timberer, a man whose life had been spent shoring up tunnels hundreds of feet below the earth, understand about the physics of air that a county land agent, a man who measured the prairie in square miles, had missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of the frontier, to the ingenious solutions that pioneers devised to survive in the harshest of environments. The story of Mawgan Bolitho is one of the most remarkable. I promise if you stick with us for the next few minutes, you will learn a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that could change the way you think about heating your own home. To make sure you don't miss future stories of frontier genius, take a moment to subscribe and click the bell. And tell us in the comments, what's the most unconventional house you've ever seen? Mawgan Bolitho was not a farmer. He had no feel for the rhythm of seasons, the language of crops. He was not a carpenter, like Caleb Finch, who could read the grain of a plank and raise a plumb wall with an artist's eye. He was a creature of the underground, a man whose trade was an intimate daily battle with gravity and pressure. In the tin mines of Cornwall, he was a timberer. His work was not to build up, but to hold up. He spent his days in the dark, damp, cool belly of the earth, setting massive timber frames, stopes, to prevent thousands of tons of granite from collapsing on the men who worked the loads. His tools were not saws and hammers, but double jacks, wedges, and blasting powder. His world was one of cold rock, the drip of constant seepage, and the physics of ventilation, how air, cold and heavy with damp, moved through the shafts and drifts. He understood that air had weight, that it had substance, and that, like water, it sought its lowest level. He had brought his wife, Lowena, and their 2 children, Jago and Carenza, to America for the promise of land, of sky, of a life lived in the sun. But their first Dakota winter had been a brutal education, a trial by a cold so absolute it felt like a living entity. He had built them a standard homesteader's cabin, a single-walled structure of green cottonwood, just as Caleb Finch had advised. It was a sieve. The cold didn't just seep in, it poured. That first winter became a litany of failures. One evening in December, as the sun set in a slash of orange, a pane of window glass, their one luxury shipped from St. Paul, split from top to bottom with a crack like a pistol shot, contracting too quickly in the sudden plunge of temperature. The leather gaskets in the water pump froze solid, then cracked like pottery shards when he tried to force the handle. Lowena's tears froze on her cheeks as she tried to comfort a shivering Carenza. The small mercury thermometer they had hung in the parlor dropped past 0, past 10 below, past 20, until the silver thread retreated into the bulb at the bottom, below the lowest number painted on the tin backing. They had survived, but only just. They had huddled around the stove, feeding it a desperate, constant diet of wood, burning through a winter's supply in 6 weeks. They slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. Mawgan knew he could not ask his family to endure another winter like that. He had failed them with the conventional wisdom. Now, he would rely on his own. The problem, as Mawgan understood it, was not the cabin itself. Caleb Finch had built it to the best of his ability, and it was no different from any other on the prairie. The problem was the design. The design was an invitation to the cold. Every homesteader in Rolla country faced the same losing battle. Silas Meade, their neighbor to the east, burned 4 cords of wood a month just to keep his main room above freezing. His wife, Martha, pasted newspaper over the interior walls, a futile attempt to block the drafts that knifed through the chinking. Their children were perpetually sick with coughs. The failure was rooted in a misunderstanding of the enemy. Settlers thought the enemy was the outside temperature. They fought it with fire, a brute force solution. But the true enemy was convection, the relentless cycle of air movement. In a standard cabin, the stove heats the air, causing it to rise to the ceiling. This creates a vacuum at the floor level, which sucks in frigid air from every crack, every seam around the door and windows. This dense, cold air, a cubic foot of it at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, is nearly 10% heavier than air at 70 degrees, pools on the floor, chilling the inhabitants from the feet up. The warm air, pushed against the ceiling, quickly loses its heat to the cold roof boards and falls, completing the miserable cycle. The candle on the Meade's table flickered constantly, not from a draft through a single hole, but from the massive, invisible river of cold air flowing across their floor. A conventional cabin was a perfect machine for being cold. It actively circulated the very element it was meant to keep out. Mawgan had watched this process, this physical law asserting itself, and knew that fighting it with more wood was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. You couldn't win by fighting harder. You had to change the rules of the fight itself. So, in the heat of August, he began to build. The digging was the hardest part. The prairie soil was a foot of black loam over a dense, stubborn layer of glacial clay. He worked from sunup to sundown, a solitary, methodical engine of labor. Lowena brought him his meals at the edge of the pit, her face a mixture of trust and deep anxiety. "Are you sure, Mawgan?" she asked one day, watching him hoist another bucket of clay. "Donovan Pridemore, he says we will lose the claim." "We will not lose the claim," Mawgan said, not looking up. "And we will not be cold." Once the 9-foot-deep rectangle was excavated, he began lining the walls. He used fieldstone, hauled from the coulees on a stone boat pulled by his single ox. He was not a mason, so he did not try to be one. He laid the stones without mortar, fitting them together like a vast, irregular puzzle. Behind the stones, he packed a thick layer of the excavated clay, tamping it down to create an impermeable barrier. He was not building a wall to fight the cold. He was borrowing the Earth's own insulation. 9 feet below the surface, the ground temperature in North Dakota remains a relatively constant 50 to 55 degrees, regardless of the season. His walls were not a barrier, but a connection to this immense thermal battery. For the roof, he laid heavy cottonwood beams across the opening, spacing them 2 feet apart. On top of these, he laid a solid deck of thick planks, and on top of that, a layer of tar paper. Then came the final, crucial element. He and Lowena spent a week carefully cutting squares of the original prairie sod and laying them over the roof, grass side up, creating a living blanket 2 feet thick. The structure was now a stone-lined, earth-covered box. The only access was a 3 by 3 foot hole left in the roof at one end. Over this, he built a small, conventional-looking shed, a mudroom no bigger than an outhouse, with a normal vertical door facing south. But the floor of this mudroom was where the true genius of the design lay. He built a heavy, insulated trapdoor, set flush with the floorboards. This door, when closed, would seal the entrance to the living space below. A steep set of stairs, almost a ladder, led down from the trapdoor into the main room. Inside the subterranean space, he built a small, remarkably efficient brick stove, venting it through a narrow pipe that ran up through the sod roof. He plastered the interior stone walls with a smooth coat of clay and whitewashed them, making the space surprisingly bright. Caleb Finch and Silas Meade stopped by again in late September, just as he was finishing. They stood in the mudroom, peering down the open hatch into the space below. "It's a tomb, Bolitho," Finch said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Clean, I'll give you that, but a tomb." Donovan Pridemore made his final official visit a week later. He did not descend the ladder. He stood at the edge, his notebook in hand. "I'm warning you for the last time," he said, his voice flat. "The inspector is due in the spring. When he sees this, he won't approve it. It doesn't meet the definition of an improved dwelling. You're gambling your family's future on a hole in the ground." "The ground is a good thing to have on your side," Mawgan replied quietly, closing the heavy trapdoor with a solid, satisfying thud. The sound sealed the argument. The physics of Mawgan's design were simple, yet profound. They were the physics of a tin mine, not a prairie cabin. The principle was convective stratification, a technical term for a simple truth. Cold air is dense and heavy. Warm air is light and buoyant. In every conventional house, the door is a vertical opening at the bottom of the structure. When you open it in winter, the heavier cold air from outside immediately flows in along the floor, like water pouring from a bucket. It forcibly displaces the lighter, warmer air, which is pushed up and often out through gaps in the ceiling or upper walls. The house is a battlefield of competing air masses. Mawgan's design created a truce by separating the combatants. The living quarters were a sealed pocket of warm, low-density air. The only connection to the outside was through the mudroom, which acted as an airlock. When Mawgan opened the exterior door of the mudroom, a blast of Arctic air would fill the small, unheated space. But that air, being dense and heavy, would simply sit there, pooled on the mudroom floor. It could not get into the house below for one simple reason. It could not fall down through a closed, horizontal door. To enter the house, the cold air would have to perform an impossible feat of physics. It would need to lift the heavy, insulated trapdoor from below, flow down the stairs against its own nature, and then be strong enough to displace the entire volume of lighter, warmer air, pushing it up and out through the same hatch. It was like asking water to flow uphill. The warm air was effectively trapped, protected by a buffer zone of cold, heavy air sitting on the lid of its container. The small brick stove didn't have to fight the entire Dakota winter. It only had to maintain the temperature in a sealed, earth-insulated chamber, a far easier task. A single armload of wood could keep the space at a stable 55 degrees for a full day. The earth walls provided the insulation, and the trap door provided the lock against convection. It was a design of profound elegance, born in the darkness of a Cornish mine. January brought the test. A Dakota ground blizzard descended upon the plains. It was not a gentle snowfall, but a horizontal assault. For 6 days and 6 nights, the world disappeared into a screaming, white void. The wind, a steady 55 miles per hour, picked up the existing snow and hurled it with the force of sand blasting. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero, with a wind chill that defied measurement. Drifts climbed to the eaves of conventional cabins, burying them completely. The sun was a forgotten memory. Inside the Meade cabin, life had been reduced to the grim mechanics of survival. They had moved their beds into the single room with the stove, huddling together under a mountain of quilts. The wind shrieked through the walls, and a fine powder of snow sifted in around the window frames, forming miniature dunes on the floor. Martha was constantly stuffing rags into the cracks, a futile gesture. Silas made dangerous trips to the woodpile, navigating by a rope tied between the door and the stack, returning after only minutes with his beard caked in ice. They were living in a state of siege, cold, miserable, and afraid. 9 feet below the raging storm in the Bolitho home, a different reality prevailed. The only sound from the blizzard was a faint, muffled hum, the fury of the wind muted by 2 feet of sod and 7 feet of earth. The air inside was perfectly still. There were no drafts. The flame of the lamp on their table burned with a steady, unwavering light. The small brick stove glowed with a gentle heat, consuming wood with an almost miserly efficiency. Mawgan had to add a single small log only every few hours. The temperature held at a steady 56 degrees. Jago and Carenza, wearing simple wool shirts, played a game of checkers on the floor. Lowena was kneading dough for bread, the familiar, comforting scent filling the space. But the ultimate proof, the quiet, vibrant testament to Mawgan's genius, sat on a small table in the corner directly under the ladder. It was a potted geranium, a cutting Lowena had carefully nurtured since their arrival. In the dead of a Dakota winter, during one of the worst blizzards on record, the plant was not just surviving, it was thriving. 3 brilliant, defiant red blossoms were open, a splash of summer color in a world of white fury. It was a biological impossibility made possible by physics. On the 4th day of the blizzard, Donovan Pridemore and 2 men from the land office were trying to get back to Rolla after checking a survey marker. They were caught in the open prairie miles from town. The storm had turned on them with shocking speed. Their horses, blinded by the blowing snow and exhausted from battling the wind, refused to go on. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The world was a churning, featureless chaos. They were lost, and Pridemore, a man of maps and certainties, knew with a sickening dread that they were going to die. The cold was a physical pain, and their movements were becoming clumsy, the first sign of advanced hypothermia. Through the shrieking wind, Pridemore tried to think. He remembered passing near the Bolitho claim earlier that day. He had scoffed at the sight. Just a small shed and a stovepipe sticking out of a snow-covered mound. A madman's folly. Now that folly was their only hope. He knew the approximate direction. Leaving the other men with the horses, he began to walk, stumbling through drifts that were waist-deep, then chest-deep. He was searching for a tiny shed in a universe of white. It was hopeless. He shouted Mawgan's name, but the wind tore the sound from his lips and flung it away. He had almost given up, his body screaming for him to lie down and let the cold take him, when he saw it. It wasn't the shed. It was a subtle anomaly in the snow at his feet. A dark, shallow circle, no more than 3 feet across, where the snow was not accumulating. It was a faint saucer in the otherwise uniform drift, a place where the snow was melting from below. The heat from the stovepipe was negligible, but the slight, constant leakage of warmth from the entire living space through the sod roof, a temperature differential of nearly 80 degrees, was just enough to eat away at the snowpack. He fell to his knees and dug with frozen, frantic hands. He hit the wooden roof of the mudroom. Crying with a mixture of relief and desperation, he clawed his way to the door, wrenched it open against the packed snow, and fell inside the small, dark space. He was safe from the wind, but the cold was still intense. He saw the trap door in the floor. He pounded on it with his fist. "Bolitho, in God's name, open up!" A moment later, he heard the scraping of a bolt, and the heavy door lifted. A column of air rose to meet him. This is where the scene etched itself into his memory. He braced for the expected sensation. The damp, frigid air of a cellar. The smell of rot and earth. That was what his experience told him a hole in the ground should feel like. Instead, the air that washed over his face was warm. Not just less cold, but actively, impossibly warm. It was dry. It smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. He stared down into the lamplit room at the faces of Mawgan and Lowena looking up at him. He descended the ladder, his legs shaking from cold and exhaustion. His boots hit the dry wooden floor. The stillness was absolute. He looked at the children playing, at the steady lamp flame. And then he saw it. The geranium, with its 3 crimson flowers burning like embers against the whitewashed wall. The gap between what he knew to be true and what he was experiencing was too vast to bridge with logic. His entire understanding of the prairie, of winter, of shelter, collapsed in that moment. He took off his ice-crusted gloves and held his bare hands out to the small stove. The feeling returned, painful and welcome. He looked at Mawgan Bolitho, the quiet, stubborn man he had dismissed as a fool. The words of apology, of gratitude, died in his throat, replaced by a single, awestruck sentence of comprehension. "My God, Bolitho," Donovan Pridemore whispered, his voice cracking. "You didn't build a house. You built a harbor." After the storm broke, Pridemore returned to his office in Rolla, a changed man. He retrieved Mawgan Bolitho's file, crossed out his own doubtful notes in the margins, and wrote in a firm, clear hand, "Claim approved. Dwelling exceeds requirements for permanent habitation through an advanced subterranean design of superior thermal efficiency." He filed it without another word. The official threat was gone. But the real spread of the idea didn't happen through government channels. It happened over kitchen tables and through the mail. Pridemore told his wife Eleanor the entire story. The blizzard being lost, the saucer of melted snow, and most vividly, the geranium blooming in the middle of the white hell. Eleanor, a practical woman who managed her own household's war against the cold, was captivated by that single image. The geranium was not a statistic or a temperature reading. It was proof of life, of normalcy, in a season of death. That week, she wrote her regular letters to 7 of her friends, the wives of other homesteaders and ranchers scattered across the county. In each letter, after the usual news, she added a long paragraph describing the Bolithos' winter quarters, as she called it. She didn't focus on the engineering. She focused on the result. And Donovan says, in the midst of that terrible storm, Mawgan Bolitho had a red geranium in full bloom on her table. Imagine that. Not a worry for wood, the children comfortable on the floor, while the rest of us were freezing in our beds. The geranium letter, as it came to be known, passed from hand to hand that winter. Women read it and passed it to their neighbors. Men, hearing the story from their wives, would ride over to the Bolitho claim, skeptical at first, and ask to see the place. Mawgan, a man of few words, would simply invite them down the ladder. They would descend from the biting wind into the calm, stable warmth, and they would understand. That spring, a dozen new excavations began across Rolla country. They weren't called cellars or dugouts. Everyone called them Bolitho winter quarters. Mawgan Bolitho's mine-timbering knowledge had, in essence, rediscovered the ancient principle of the earth-sheltered home. His innovation, born of necessity and a deep, practical understanding of physics, anticipated the core concepts of modern passive house design and geothermal insulation by nearly a century. He was not an architect or an engineer in the formal sense, but he possessed a working knowledge of thermal mass, air density, and natural insulation that surpassed that of the university-trained men who were designing buildings back east. He understood that the earth itself was not an obstacle to be overcome, but a powerful ally to be embraced, an immense, stable reservoir of moderate temperature waiting to be tapped. The frontier narrative is often one of conquest, of men battling the elements, breaking the sod, felling the forests, and imposing their will upon a hostile landscape. It is a story of fighting. Mawgan Bolitho's story offers a different, quieter, and perhaps wiser narrative. His genius was not in confrontation but in accommodation. He saw the Dakota winter not as an enemy to be fought with a bigger fire, but as a physical force with predictable properties. Cold was heavy. Cold sank. Cold could not climb. He didn't fight the cold. He simply stepped aside and let it pass over him. He built his home in a sanctuary the cold could not invade, not because of the strength of his walls, but because of the elegance of his design. He didn't build a fortress to withstand a siege. He set a stair where cold could not follow. It was the profound, simple wisdom of the underground brought to the windswept surface of the American plains. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity as inspiring as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other historical innovations deserve to be remembered? Disclaimer. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. However, the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices of earth-sheltered dwellings. Any application of these or similar techniques today should be undertaken in compliance with modern building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.